So when the organizers were getting together the conference, we recognized that it was the 25th anniversary of CSPT, and we wanted to do something special to look at the past, present, and future of interdisciplinary thought and work within the University of Victoria and then within academic spaces in general. So with that in mind, we wanted to bring together founding members and longtime members of the CSPT program here, as well as newer faculty and also student participants in the program to engage with these questions. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Liam Trimble, who is an alumnus of the CSPT program. He's currently a professor at Trent University in the Cultural Studies program, and he's agreed to moderate this panel. So, Liam.
Thanks very much, Kim. And thanks to the organizers and to everyone for having me back. It's great. I miss this place every day. There's nothing wrong with Trent University, don't get me wrong, but CSPT has something very special going on here, and I'm happy to be here. So the theme for the panel, as I understand it, based on what the panelists or the organizers have told me, is the social, political, and cultural kind of themes with which we're all concerned, and how the different knowledge production practices that we're engaged in at the university and outside the university affect those things. In particular, we're concerned with the current political and institutional context of programs like this and at the university in general, by which I mean an atmosphere of increasing austerity and technologization and so on and so forth. What does that mean for how we do thought, produce knowledge, do the work that we have, teach students, and so on? That would be in the context of things like the student protests, Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, and all of that. These were mentioned as themes that we should be recognizing. These would be a response to the neoliberalization of the university. And one of the questions that all of the different panelists here will be addressing is whether there is any kind of alternative to simply refusing that logic of capital when it comes to the organization of the university. Are students just, in fact, numbers? Are we just trying to acquire more of them and process them and so on and so forth? Can we just simply say, no, that's not good enough, and do something else? And two other key questions that we'll be looking to address are interdisciplinarity and theory, kind of in general. So in terms of interdisciplinarity, we'll be asking, does it allow us now to think in a non-institutional fashion when we actually have an institutionalized form of interdisciplinarity at this university and elsewhere? Because at one time, interdisciplinarity was something of a rallying call. That's obviously changed now. So what does interdisciplinarity mean, particularly in the context of radical thought? And in terms of theory, is it the case that CSPT as a program and as what we're doing here now focuses less on theory in some abstract sense? Are we more concerned with cultural objects, with political issues, and what are the implications of that? These are some of the general themes that the panel will be addressing. And as I understand my role, I'm principally just facilitating rather than asking questions or making any comments myself. So I'll sit back, and what we're going to do is move just from right to left, starting with Rob Walker, speaking one by one for about 5 or 8 minutes, I think. If you're grotesquely over time, we'll cut you off because we don't want to go too far. And then we'll just open it up for a more general conversation among the panelists. So I'll start at my left, just introducing who we have. Reagan Burles is a recent graduate of the program. He's a master's student in political science and CSPT. Payman Vahabzadeh is a professor in sociology here in CSPT and the current director of the program. He was also the third person on my examining committee. Jeanette Parker, who is a PhD candidate in in English and in CSPT. She moonlights as a political James Rowe, who is in the School of Environmental Science. Gregory Blue in history, and you've been here almost as long as the program has existed. Almost. And finally, Rob Walker, who is in political science at CSPT. Rob is one of the founding members of the program, and he'll be starting us off tonight.
5 minutes, 5 points, very short order. I'd like to, well, I should say, I'm very proud of this program. One never expected it to survive. One never expected it to have achieved what it's achieved. I'm very proud of the program and very proud of my colleagues on it. But I will be looking backward rather than forward. It's founded in a particular historical moment. Internally, the University of Victoria was a rising institution, but not one that was particularly interested in theory. Its general strength is, I guess, a certain level of competence, especially in the sciences. And one would have to say, when I came here in 1980, there weren't many theoretical persons that one could talk with. So, loneliness is important. Of course, in BC at the time, there were all kinds of political struggles. It was kind of exciting. There were thousands gathered on the lawns protesting the government. Cutbacks by one of the richest jurisdictions in the world. So lots of things happened, and the CSPT program essentially grew out of the feeling amongst some faculty that we needed to have a solidarity within the university as well as solidarity outside the university. And especially that solidarity could come from people in various departments who were lonely. Lonely in philosophy, lonely in sociology, lonely in politics especially. And so we thought about how to put the thing together. The external context is also important. It's not explainable simply in terms of local politics. There was a geopolitical moment, the end of the Cold War. There was a particular moment in which this general social democratic Keynesian world was giving way to the now well-known neoliberal world. An interesting moment, and indeed I would explain the program quite as much in terms of external things as internal things. The program thrives on three different dimensions. One is theory, and I'll come to theory in a moment. One is interdisciplinarity, and one is novelty. Novelty, because actually a program like this has been able to take on questions and dynamics that the regular departments, regular institutions could not deal with. At that time, globalization was becoming trendy, but not very well known. Localization of all kinds, environmentalism, identity politics of all kinds. Lots of things were bubbling, and the regular departments were, how should we say, rather conservative. We offered the possibility of doing something new, and I think that's actually quite crucial to understanding how the program survived. Secondly, interdisciplinarity. This is one of the most disciplined universities I've ever taught in. Geographically disciplined by buildings and quite disciplined by the institutions of curricula. So we understood the necessity of thinking across departments, across boundaries if you like, and most of us understood as theorists you simply could not be professionally competent as theorists unless you did interdisciplinarity. It's simply not done. And so there was a dynamic coming from that. And then there's theory. And theory has in the end been, I would say, the most interesting dimension, but also the most problematic dimension. The name of the program was Contemporary Social something, and Political Thought. Anyway, that name is thought, not theory. Theory at the time, and perhaps to some extent still, is a politically charged term. It means different things, and everyone owns it. Everyone owns it. And there are many serious difficulties in thinking about what theory is. We still have these difficulties, and the program will have to continue to work with these difficulties, but they will be historically contextualized. There's the question of the relationship between empirical theory. Well, okay. There's the question of the Anglo-American and continental European traditions. CSPT is largely derived from the continental European traditions, I would say. There's the difference between critical traditions and analytical traditions. And analytical traditions are quite often progressive and liberal, but not quite in the way that CSPT has framed the progressive and the liberal. To the extent that we have a theory tradition here, I would say it's characterized by three sorts of interests. One is the notion that it's historical. That is to say, one cannot do theory unless you understand the history of thought in some way. That's quite close to my own heart. Another is that it's somehow informed by an awareness of basic philosophical traditions without being philosophy. And thirdly, it's aware of the relationship between knowledge and politics, knowledge and power, if you want. Putting those three things together, you have some way of understanding the kind of conversations which occur in the CSPT program, which do not really occur in very many other places in the modern university. At the same time, it's understood that all those three terms, the meaning of history, the meaning of philosophy, and the meaning of political, is in doubt. And actually, this is a comment on radical. I would be very resistant to replacing the term political with radical. It's political, and political may be radical or not, and radical may indeed be radical or not. There is the whole question of the co-optation of dissent, and the degree to which to be radical is to go to the root, not necessarily to be on any predetermined understanding of the left. And one of the strengths of CSPT, I think, has been to insist upon the priority of the radical in the sense of going to the root, not necessarily being explicitly of any particular political persuasion. Institutionalization. Well, it was difficult to get this thing institutionalized, at least in a way which had very deep roots into the purse strings of the university. We thrived, if I can use that term, on very, very little. We were very, we did a lot with some generous funding from some deans. When I say generous, I'm being slightly ironical. There wasn't much money around. This was a precondition of our success, actually, and I think it remains the case now. Bigger is not necessarily better. I once gave a lecture under that title to a very large audience at the Bombay Cricket Stadium. Bigger is not necessarily better. And I think that theorists in particular have to understand that their work is not expensive. Therefore, they do not have to be tied to too many institutional purse strings. There's an enormous amount of freedom to be gained for theorists by being poor. Okay. And finally, the other reason we've survived, I think, is that we're actually pretty good. Not to toot one's own horn too much, but we have learnt that if you're going to survive, you have to be twice as good as the conventional people. If you're going to survive, you have to maintain credibility, authority. In the university world especially, it is absolutely crucial that people give you respect. They may not like what you say, but you have to be as good as any mainstream in many of the mainstream tasks, and you have to do very well at what you claim to do as theorists. So it's not something you can actually have lower standards for. You don't have to go for size and money and massive resources. The institutionalization works to the extent that it's not tied to institutions. But nevertheless, you need some institutional base in order to maintain your credibility. And the capacity to read the political character of academic institutional politics, I think, is central. And I think we've been very lucky in the way in which the program has had a shared leadership, shared understanding amongst its various leaders, that that kind of operation is the only way in which it's now possible to do serious theoretical work in the modern academy. And it's not easy even now.
Thanks, Rob. Great. Let's leave it. Well, Rob's remarks were very enlightening and very provocative, or evocative. Provocative maybe too, but we can come to that. I feel a bit of a fraud here because I'm not a founding member, as the program said, but I've been here for a long time. I'm also from the department that's probably over the last 20 years had the least involvement in terms of students in CSPT, even though, as Rob said, the program has been oriented towards giving a historical context towards theory. So that's an issue that of institutional disciplinarity and maybe a horizon that's something that can be challenged in the future, I would hope. Going back to the name, when I joined the program, it was still contemporary social and political thought. And I believe that it changed in the early 2000s when English became a major player in the program. And until that time, English had not been a participant. We started off, as Rob said, with philosophy being one of the participating departments, as one would expect, given the theoretical orientation, but first the department as a whole pulled away from the program, and we had one philosophy member, Monica Langer, and then she retired and we had none, so there was a reorientation institutionally. But this leads me to one of the key ideas that I'd like to make, and that is I think that CSPT does gain and has gained from having outreach in a variety of directions. And this is both in terms of input for the program, with various faculty members from various departments taking part, and CSPT can also have a challenging effect across the campus the more units are brought in one way or another. So there's a balance, I think, to be maintained between having core faculty who have some cohesion and having a variety of inputs. Maybe that's something we can discuss. The conference theme, Thinking as a Way of Life, I found interesting when it first came to me, and a number of things came to mind. On the one hand, thinking as a way of life. I was wondering what's this meant to evoke? Is this a kind of traditional contemplative life? Via contemplativa, coming out of the medieval tradition, apart from active life. CSPT has never been that in my experience, as Rob said. It's also always been engaged with real politics, and that's what the contemporary, I think, one of the things the contemporary signaled in the original program name. And I think that the program, to a large extent, has kept that focus on political dimensions of theory and how theory can affect politics and change in the broader world. So in that sense, the program has been more in line with Marx's dictum that philosophers have interpreted the world. The point is to change it. Interpretation and change aren't exclusive of one another. There's a dialectical relation between them all always. And theory is challenged by the problems that we face in the contemporary world, and the politics can be radically transformed by having a coherent set of theoretical discussions involved in it. So that raises the issue about the role of of theory in change, but more broadly of critical thought in change, in political change. And there's an old saying, some of you will recognize coming out of the Marxist tradition, that without a revolutionary theory, there's no revolutionary movement. One of the things that CSPT, I think, has done is helped get people to focus on the cohesion of thought, their thinking, and of the way theories relate to one another. As Rob said, it's never been, the program hasn't focused just on one body of theory, but it's involved entertaining a variety of bodies of theory. Entertaining, to some extent, that means sitting everybody down and, for example, in CSPT 501, having a conversation at the table. Right? Entertaining in a social sense, but getting people thinking critically about terms and ideas that are often bandied about quite spontaneously, unsystematically in political discourse. But the idea of bringing a critical dimension and a comparative dimension. One of the important parts of the program for me, and for, I think, programs elsewhere in contemporary social and political thought, is the international dimension. And this is something that has been pushed forward by the CSPT program, but I think can also be further pursued, partly because the traditions of theory that we engage with are often products of the European or North American experience, but they've been picked up, developed, engaged with in other parts of the world too, and seeing the way theory works in other parts of the world as well as in Victoria or Canada or North America or the Western world is an important role, I think, and a horizon for us to aim for. So I will end my comments.
Thanks very much. James.
Cool. Thank you very much. So I think I was in grade 4 when this program got started. So I'm going to be doing a bit more looking forward than looking back. I don't think I'd even discovered Calvin and Hobbes, let alone Hobbes himself at that age. I guess to continue with the Hobbes jokes, I was nasty, brutish, and short in grade 4. There's a R.B.J. quote of, "Evil is a robust child." And so that's where I was at when this program was starting up. So thank you very much to everyone for being here. It's a real pleasure joining this panel and engaging in these conversations. I was an undergraduate here at UVic, studying with Rob Walker, Warren Magnuson, Kara Shaw, Aaron DeVore, all associated with the CSPT program. Also completed graduate studies in politics and the history of consciousness at UC Santa Cruz, and I'm currently teaching in environmental studies. And so I've encountered the challenges with, but also the great power of interdisciplinary education. I wanted to take my 5 to 8 minutes to share some thoughts on the meaning of critical education today, both institutional and popular, but primarily focused on the university setting, given that that's where we are. I'm consistently struck by how students in my undergraduate classes name education as the solution to our many environmental and social challenges. When given the opportunity to engage politically, the default move is often events, workshops, or actions that are primarily geared towards raising awareness. There's a generalized assumption among the students I work with that raising collective awareness can advance us towards genuine sustainability and equity. This assumption is accompanied, I think, by a fantastical understanding of politics as a process wherein reasoned and impassioned argument can carry the day. I personally like this fantasy. I wish it were true. It is, of course, not. The contemporary political terrain is shaped by concentrated economic power. Raising awareness remains an important political tactic, but it's far more effective when supported by huge concentrations of wealth. Globally, corporations spend $266 billion per year on advertising alone. Awareness raising par excellence. I'm increasingly moved by the revolutionary Marxist claim that until concentrations of wealth and productive assets more generally are brought under some form of collective control, then we'll see more regress than progress on problematics like climate change and inequality. So, what then is to be done? Raising awareness will not do, but I'm sympathetic to this move. I was politicized in a university classroom. I imagine that others here were too, and I thus feel some fidelity to that conversion experience. Also, what the hell else is this job if not raising awareness? The lectures and articles I write, with their relatively small audiences, are ultimately about raising awareness. Critically educating students in the case of lecturing, and hopefully advancing political debate in the case of academic and sometimes popular publishing. It is no wonder that university students bias towards education and awareness raising as their political tools of choice. This is what we teach them, in form, if not in substance. The concrete questions these ruminations beg for me is, how can I educate for power? How can we best direct awareness towards the need for and conduct of revolutionary expropriation? I should be clear that I do not assume that socializing wealth would automatically end hierarchies of status, race, gender, sexuality, nationality, ability, body size, species, all the ways humans find to distinguish and to dominate. Indeed, I would argue, an argument that Rob alerted me to as an undergraduate, I'd argue that a culturally mediated fear of death and the felt servility we humans can feel before it is a driving cause of domination along the axes of race, class, gender, species. Socializing wealth will not undo our ambivalences towards mortality and the will of the domination that these ambivalences can generate. But socialized wealth could be marshaled to improve public education and public life, to include time and space for embodied practices like meditation, yoga, ceremony, that can help transform existential and embodied fear into a cheerful affirmation of earthly life. The theory being that humans contented with their existential situation are less liable to engage in compensatory status seeking along the axes of domination we know too well. Even if this theory doesn't quite pan out, think about the collective resources that could be devoted towards decolonizing feminist, anti-racist, environmental, and general anti-oppression education, teaching positions many people in this room are well positioned to take up if we had the collective resource to open them up. And so, how can the substance and form of critical education today prepare us to expropriate, to challenge concentrated economic power, bring it under social and democratic control, while simultaneously facilitating decolonization in colonial contexts like British Columbia? No answer to this question will be satisfying, especially given our time constraints. What I love about these 5-minute things, I can just say wild things and then I don't have to substantiate them. I just have 5 minutes, that's it. 5 minutes. So, you can't give a satisfying answer, but facilitating classroom and public discussion of revolutionary change by engaging new texts like David Harvey's 17 Contradictions in the End of Capitalism, Harsha Walia's Undoing Border Imperialism, Glenn Coulthardt's For Our Nations to Live, Capitalism Must Die, Benjamin Kunkel's Utopia or Bust, and Naomi Klein's forthcoming book on climate change is a start. The same can be said about the unfolding reaction to Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, the current bestseller on Amazon.com, and the seeming contradiction between the radical implications of Piketty's analysis and his focus on legislative reform, a global wealth tax. Similarly, while not revolutionary in orientation, campaigns like fossil fuel divestment can help reveal how concentrated economic power often gets in the way of wise political decision making. Current divest campaigns can be effective teaching tools. 6 out of the 10 largest companies in the world are oil companies. Big surprise that action on climate change has been stalled. Divest campaigns help undermine the social license of oil companies, making room for collective challenge to their concentrated power. They also reveal how working people, including faculty, have very little control over their multi-million-dollar pension funds, which could be wielded for far more collective benefit than they currently are. So this is my way of sneaking in a plug for Divest UVic and other such campaigns across North America. My ultimate awareness-raising contribution this evening is an encouragement, this is for myself and for others, an encouragement to educate for power, educate for collective expropriation. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
I want to thank the organizers of this year's conference for inviting me to participate in this roundtable and stepping in last minute for someone who couldn't be here tonight. So these reflections are kind of just what I could come up with this afternoon. So I've been a student in the CSPT program for quite some time now. After narrowly surviving the profound existential trial that is the master's thesis, I completed my MA here in 2011 and began the PhD the following year. I came to CSPT from a discipline other than those included in its current framework, from visual art. And this experience, along with the experience of being an English student, at least in title, in a program that has historically tended to lean more towards the side of political science. These things have made me reflect a lot on how theory as a field, a sub-discipline, or a quasi-discipline is highly contested. What counts as theory, in other words, is defined and delimited very differently within different disciplinary contexts, as all of everyone here has been saying. The strange solitary pleasure and suffering of attempting to do thinking as a way of life over the year of studying for my candidacy exams has also led me to think still further on this issue. What is the use of doing theory? And what is at stake in the insistent demand to define it as something useful? So I completed the last of my 2 exams a little over a month ago, and both of these exams, one in English and one in CSPT, were defined as theory exams. In other words, I spent the last several months studying this thing called theory, first of all from a disciplinary angle, modern critical theory as defined by English, and then again from the interdisciplinary approach opened up by CSPT. And since the comprehensive exams, we are told, are a major step on the so-called process of so-called academic professionalization, and I am now, from a certain institutional perspective, defined as a candidate on this path towards being a professional thinker, in lots of quotation marks. I've still been thinking a lot about the place or displacement of theoretical work, and more broadly of the critical activity of thinking itself in the university context over the last few years. So what is the field or subfield of theory in the contemporary university? How can theory work to destabilize disciplinary, institutional, or other boundary formations, logics, and systems of management? How might theoretical work itself be a form of political intervention, refusal, or counter-conduct at a time when neoliberal modes of governance have risen to a hegemonic position that's fairly firmly entrenched and naturalized? So the problem of how to meaningfully contest this naturalized logic is a problem for all of us. These are large and complex questions, which I'm hoping we've begun to untangle here and over the course of the conference. So far I've been speaking in a fairly autobiographical mode. In truth, it's sort of the only way I could think to enter into this conversation, by commenting on my own experience in this program, which has taught me to ask theoretical questions. And from there to begin to reflexively question the precarious status of theory and of theorists in an academic milieu increasingly governed by market logics, by the neoliberal demand to compete and to produce and to reproduce knowledges that would be already intelligible, useful, and saleable. So this is pretty much all I have to say, but having done so much reading recently, I thought I would sort of call up a couple of quotations that to my mind speak to these issues of the place or placelessness of theory and of thinking in contemporary social and political life. My hope is that these little quotations might help to orient our discussion or else send it off in some other directions. And the first one is from a book that some of us read in Arthur Croker's class on power and resistance. It's Gerald Ronig's book, Factories of Knowledge, Industries of Creativity. And I think this was sort of an inspiration for some of the people who planned this conference. So the quote begins, "The way in which students and knowledge workers live are marked by dispersion and permanent flexibility. Subservient deterritorialization is their normality. They are perpetually fleeing in all directions, just because they are compelled by precaritization to do so. Yet they also produce desires for production in dispersion. Their scurrying back and forth, the streaming constant overflowing of a tangible and governable community, is not only marked by necessity, but also by a desire for fleeing without need. For a multitude so scattered and flexible, however, questions of assembly, condensation, reterritorialization arise. Questions of the form and place of reterritorialization. And it has only been a matter of time that the people working in different ways in the university would make the situation in the knowledge factory not only the starting point, but also the focal point for their struggle." And then the second thing that I wanted to bring into this conversation, it's another sort of passage on the activity of thinking in general, which I think definitely speaks to this year's conference theme, speaking as a way, or thinking as a way of life. And this is from Hannah Arendt's The Life of the Mind, where she's questioning what thinking as a solitary and inherently useless activity may have to do with both political action and ethical responsibility. And I think Arendt is more on the side of a distinction between thinking and political action than most of us here are, the kind of vita contemplativa as something set apart from politics. But anyways, this might be helpful. Thinking in its non-cognitive, non-specialized sense as a natural movement of life, the actualization of the difference given in consciousness, is not the prerogative of the few, but an ever-present faculty in everybody. By the same token, Inability to think is not the failing of the many who lack brain power, but the ever-present possibility of everybody, scientists, scholars, and other specialists in mental enterprise not excluded. Everybody may come to shun that thoughtful intercourse with oneself, whose feasibility and importance Socrates first discovered. Thinking accompanies life and is itself the dematerialized quintessence of being alive, and since life is a process, its quintessence can only lie in the actual thinking process and not in solid results or specific thoughts. A life without thinking is quite possible, but it fails to develop its own essence. It is not merely meaningless, it is not fully alive. Unthinking men are like sleepwalkers. And then she goes on to say, thinking does not create values. It will not find out once and for all what the good is. It does not conform, but rather dissolves accepted rules of conduct. And it has no political relevance unless special emergencies arise. That while I am alive, I must be able to live with myself and to think with myself is a consideration that does not come up politically except in boundary situations. And I think that CSPT is a program that very much concerns itself with finding and questioning those boundary situations and the boundaries between disciplines themselves. And so thinking in this context becomes a political activity, or one that, I guess, reveals that it is already political. So that's all I have to say.
Payment.
So I'm here partly because I'm the director of the CSPT program, but I'm afraid I cannot be purely a director at this point. I would like to consider myself as the stranger from the land of acquaintance, as Rumi called it. So I'm a kind of insider-outsider to CSPT. I brought this very historical object called The New Reality. It's the book of, in 1984 that became a British Columbia bestseller. And the authors of this book and the editors of this book actually later on founded the CSPT. For me, this has a historical significance. Of course, later on you can see the book, even touch it. It's been gifted to me by Bill Carroll, so it's just such a treasure to have. This book represents to me the way CSPT worked itself out into a academic program, into a disciplinary academic program. So a few things basically come to my mind. Number one, the concept or the notion of thought, right? And as Jeanette just said, relating back to Hannah Arendt and pre-Socrates, ever since pre-Socratics, thought has been this activity of, in solitude, reflecting on matters that compel us to respond and to reflect on, right? And this is basically what, the program is all about. We reflect on matters at hand. We reflect on that which pertains to us and compels us to respond, right? To that, I would like to add that, the whole notion of interdisciplinarity, that thought has no limits, and these limits on thought in terms of academic programs are really kind of institutionalized forms of knowledge, and institutionalized so that they would be in control of powers that be. There is no point trying to hide that or trying to show that universities are actually kind of places of knowledge, just purely dedicated to knowledge, because they're not. As somebody who has come to university basically by accident and much later in his life, and with no plan whatsoever, just kind of was dropped here in university. These are the sort of things that I want to point out and sort of pull together, if you like. We are looking at a university that in about 10, 20, 30 years will not look like what it is today. And the new challenge or the new reality, quote unquote, of the university compels us to rethink our programs and rethink of our programs in such a way that they kind of basically relate us back to the origins of how programs such as CSPT started off, and that is through praxis, right? So in thinking the future of CSPT, a program that I appreciate very much and adore and so on, I really am at all times forced to think with certain amount of anxiety and fright, whether the future university will actually have a space for this kind of interdisciplinary thought. Catherine said that the graduates of CSPT have become agents of change, and I think that's absolutely correct, right? But I think we need to think further and beyond the university as a place where CSPT can actually have some effect. How we can think about it, I have no idea, no suggestion here also. But I think that in 20, 30 years, if this neoliberal assault is successful, we are not going to have a university like this anymore. And we have to really sit down and think about the future of our programs. The programs that we love, absolutely, and the programs that actually produce so much vigor and energy and have actually affected social change. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So Rob began by talking a bit about the historical moment that CSPT was born in, but I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the present historical moment sort of as a student, and what that might mean in terms of a little bit more specific sort of idea about where CSPT could go or how to continue that sort of critical education. And I can do James one better. I was born the same year as. So this question of how an interdisciplinary program can sort of work in a contemporary context. And it strikes me that this panel and this conference and CSPT generally are really asking some similar questions that society more broadly are asking right now, and that is the question of the university. It seems in popular media sort of negative articles about the academy have almost become like a genre unto themselves. They're so common. And partly, of course, this is the result of neoliberal dissatisfaction with older models of the university. But this discussion, I think, is happening in other ways. The Quebec student movement, the student protests recently, I think, raised, it was sort of presented as a large complaint about tuition, but I think it was actually much deeper sort of questioning of what a university is for, what public education is for, how knowledge should be produced and disseminated. So at the risk of maybe sounding naive, I think this is perhaps not a bad time to be raising the question of what a university is, its purpose, its history, and what we might like those things to be. I think this is a time when people might be a bit more open to different visions of what a university could be than is often the case. So that's one sort of thing I want to mention about context. And then the other is this immense sort of, on the other hand, this immense sort of disciplinary pressure that Jeanette alluded to compete, to do work that is sort of economically productive and things that go along with that. And so I think one of the really significant and effective things an interdisciplinary theory program can do is to problematize the university and ask questions about the university. I remember in undergrad, the first time that happened to me, I was in a third year class, and it was really just as simple as the professor asking us all, why are you sitting here listening to me speak in this specific sort of forum with desks that don't move and chairs that are attached to the desks, and why are we here? And it's something that I had thought about before, but it's something I still remember quite well. And I think in the CSPT classes I've taken where the university was sort of explicitly addressed as a object of thought or of study, those are very productive, interesting classes. And I think it's sometimes surprising how little this actually happens in a sort of formal institutional way. I think we talk about the university constantly in many ways. I talk about it with my colleagues all the time. I assume faculty do much the same thing, but that seems to not translate always into explicit discussion of the university in classroom or lecture hall or And so I'm thinking about this in the context of an interdisciplinary program, but also more broadly in terms of sort of critical education, like James alluded to. And one of the demands that often seems to be made of theory by students is that it be sort of directly relevant to their lives, their everyday lives. And so for students sitting in a classroom, there's a little more directly relevant than thinking about what a university is. So it seems to perform this sort of double function, I think. It demonstrates, it's a really good demonstration of that critical move of putting one's own situation or foundation or whatever into question. And then when that happens, it's at the same time these sort of neoliberal imperatives that are coming through and from the university perhaps become a little bit less convincing, a little bit less intimidating in some way. So all that to say, I think what has to be done really is not just within a theory program, but more broadly is sort of more explicit thinking with, existing literature on the university and thinking about the university in general within the university. And I think given the context, the historical context, the present context that I outlined, I think that's one of the easiest, really good way of helping us get a program like CSPT sort of demonstrate its worth and exercise its influence.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to every one of you. So I think the way that we could do this most productively is if I just start off with a question, and then if it moves on from there, that would be fine. I'll try to intervene as little as possible. I want to pick up on two themes that a lot of you actually mentioned. So the first being austerity. I talked about that a little bit before, but also really interesting to hear you talk about the existential threat that you try to inflict on your students. I'll put it in those terms. Existential dissatisfaction, I think, is what you said. You need to feel some kind of existential dissatisfaction in order to have some sort of change, right? And then, Jeanette, you actually used the phrase existential trial of the thesis. And Regan, I think you were saying something very similar when you were alluding to the professor saying, like, why are you sitting here in the desk? Why are you bothering doing any of this? That's a moment of self-reflection that they're trying to indicate. So that's certainly one of the ways in which you can do critical thought or critical pedagogy at the university, right? But that, it seems to me, is flying in the face of another and in some ways much greater existential threat, which students and everyone in general are just confronted with on a daily basis. Namely, you're not going to get jobs. None of you are going to get jobs. There aren't any jobs. You're going to die, right? And it's the ancient threat of capitalism, and it's why we're bound into the system and why we can't give a gift back to capital, right? It's giving us our lives. So you've got these two different kinds of desires. Well, we have the desires, critical educators, to have some sort of existential dissatisfaction fostered in students, but then they're so afraid. I've been seeing this a lot lately. I've been teaching at Trent for the last 2 years. And the smartest students are all terrified that they won't find employment. And so they're thinking, what can I do next? I don't want to go to a program like CSPT or TCP or whatever. I don't want to do that. It won't get me a job. So I suppose the question is, are there any strategies for working against that particular kind of logic? How do you do it? Both here and elsewhere. Obviously, this doesn't just happen in the context of the university, but that's what we're talking about. How do you contend with that second existential logic, that overriding capitalist threat of killing you?
You're the one who got a job.
It's
You
So let me tell an anecdote. When history first started its master's program, which I guess was about 30 years ago now, the first group of master students came in and the graduate advisor sat them down and said, look, if you want to do this, you have to do it out of interest or passion. Because if you are thinking about jobs, you're smoking something. She didn't actually say that, she was quite concerned. But anyway, it's not a realistic guarantee in any sense of a job. If you want a job, you should go get training as an electrician. And one of the students put up their hand and said, my brother's an electrician and he's unemployed too. So it's not just the best students that have that threat of unemployment. It's throughout the society. This is an issue on which students who think about theory can relate in solidarity to broader parts of the population.
One of the things I've learned in this job is actually that the theorists do get jobs. They don't get them immediately. It's usually a long and terrifying wait. But when they get them, they keep them. I have the dubious experience of being supervisors to two of the people who've run this province as the eminence gris, the major advisors behind the right-wing regimes we've had here. I don't like this, but they've both been theorists, not in CSPT, I have to say, in political science. And one of them actually sent me a letter saying, yes, I'm sorry I did this to you, and I've had a change of heart ever since. But, okay. And the other experience I've had, for one reason or another, I've done a lot of international research projects, as a result of which I get a lot of frequent flyer points, and I get to fly. And I've had meetings with very, very high officials in the European Union, head of all the police agencies, and guess what? They talk theory. You want to talk theory? You have to go to the top of corporations. You have to go to the top bureaucrats. They know what theory is for. They know that theory will kill you. They know what theory is about because it's about principles, and they have to understand the principles. They're not interested in technicians. They're not interested in bureaucrats. They're interested in people who can think quickly and that can appreciate how other people think. So the trick is actually, theorists get the very best jobs when they're about 50. getting between 28 and 50, it's a long hold.
Rob, do you try to provoke existential dissatisfaction in this language? Is that a strategy?
You don't ask me. Do I try? No, I don't try.
I should ask everyone here.
I have no doubt that I do. No, I mean, look, it's... So, I mean, I'm a political theorist. There is a reason that in political science, political theory is 25% of the curriculum. Because in the end, political science departments cannot get rid of the notion that somehow or another you need to know the Greeks. You need to know principles. You need to know constitutional law. You cannot get away with it just by being a standard social scientist. It splits the discipline. And it's the one discipline that actually has this problem. But it is fairly clear that unless you understand how principles work and how principles clash, you don't understand nothing. You can understand mere facts, and how do you know what a fact is? So actually, I'm not persuaded by any of the rhetoric that says theory is unsaleable. It's tricky for everybody to get jobs. But actually, the people who come across as being able to fit into positions which are not merely technocratic, those goes to people who can think across situations, who can think interdisciplinary. And I think anthropologists do very well in this kind of context as well. You've got to think on your feet. You've got to think across different contexts. You've got to think abstractly and be able to bring yourself down from the abstractions to the concrete in very different situations. And who is trained to do that in the modern university? So I share Payman's negativity about our future in the university. But in the end, universities, whatever they look like, are going to have to produce people who can think. And actually, theorists are pretty good at thinking, one way or another.
Yeah, sure. I just would say to that I remember as an undergraduate saying to friends that from taking a number of classes with Rob that I actually would pay to go out on a Friday or Saturday night and hear him speak. And so I didn't pay to get in here tonight, but here I am on a Friday night getting to hear Rob speak. It's excellent. Just to respond to Leon's point, I don't actually try to arouse existential angst in students, but try to make it clear that existential angst plays a far larger role in the political process than we realize. And then offer tools for relating to existential angst beyond thinking. Tools like meditation, so sort of not thinking as a way of life. On the undergraduate front, in terms of the sort of relationship between existential angst or the existential real and how that relates to the political real that we're constantly having to wrestle with, my experience, and this is of environmental studies students, and so they're a particular group, but the students are far more open to a revolutionary argument today than even 5-6 years ago. So like, to make the argument that capitalism is fundamentally unsustainable, for example, like they're just like, yeah. Yeah, old news. But then they're convinced that nothing can be done about it. And the kind of affect that emerges from seeing that our institutions are fundamentally flawed and that nothing can be done about it is a depressive affect. And there's a wonderful short little book by Mark Fisher called Capitalist Realism that sort of plumbs the sort of psyche of the current moment and nicely gets at the depressive affect that is ambient today. I don't know precisely how to relate to that, but I do think that burrowing into this acceptance that students have of revolutionary possibility, even if they don't think it's possible, is one place to start and to help them realize that it's more possible than they might realize, and that there's some openings there, but not necessarily going to guarantee them a job anytime soon by taking up a revolutionary mantle. On the graduate students front, I haven't advised long enough to see anyone go forth and get or not get jobs, but I know from having been on the job market recently that there's an interesting dynamic where, of course, the narrative afoot is that there's no jobs, which is in some respects true, and that it's extremely brutal job market for academics across the spectrum, be you theorists or not. So that narrative is operative, but then anecdotally, everyone who I know from graduate school, almost to an end, has found something that is quite good and that they're happy with. And so there's this interesting tension where there's the storyline, which has real grounding in empirical reality in terms of the number of faculty lines that open up every year, and yet most of the folks who I knew through grad school and elsewhere, they found positions. And so it is a hard job market to be entering as a theory person or as an academic at large, but at the same time, anecdotally anyways, I've seen people take up positions.
If you just want to jump in, by all means, just jump in.
Can I just reflect a little bit? I think this is a good point you raised. I think students nowadays are under siege. They are under siege by student loans. They are under siege by getting meaninglessly high grades. They are under siege by having some future planned out for them before they even started school. So I think the student dynamics have shifted. Students are forced into taking the best years of their life and some of the best experiences in their life, that's being in university, as something more serious than it really is. And I think you should think about all the fun that you have here, and all the things that you're learning here, and all the relationships and friendships that you establish here, right? And I don't know, just this job that I'm holding now is the only job I haven't quit or kicked out from. So far. So as I said, I came, I got my PhD when I was 40 years of age. So I've been doing other things, right? When I came to university here, I never thought, I would get a job, right? And in fact, between my tenure track job and my PhD, there was 6 long years of sessional teaching, right? So I think, we need to actually change our perspective. This perspective of getting jobs and so on. So all decent, all legitimate, I'm not denying that. But it's also hegemonic, right? It's instilled in our heads that as soon as you graduate, you have to get a job and so on and so forth. Even if you're an accountant, you will not get a job. Right? So I want you to think about it in those terms, that yes, it's a decent thing to expect a decent job, with decent education and so on and so forth. But there's another aspect to university, and that's the experiential aspect. You're here, you're learning fantastic things, you're having great friendships, and partake in such great conferences. I don't think anything can beat it. Really, just the best years of your life is right here, right now. So enjoy it, right? And what happens in the future will happen in the future. Don't worry. You end up like me at worst.
I'd say, in terms of, this question that as much as theory and interdisciplinarity and this sort of thing are becoming more and more marginalized as neoliberalism advances, I think it's good to remember that there's always that underside to marginalization and disavowal, which is desire. So there seems to be, and I think the sort of institutionalization of interdisciplinarity is maybe an effect of that, and there are dangers that go along with that too. And so it's tempting to think that the neoliberal university will just eradicate these things altogether. But I think that along with that sort of marginalization goes this sort of hidden desire. And so there'll always be some fascination or something that will keep the margins around to some extent.
Can I just say one of the striking things, one of the things that strikes me actually, it's CSPT. There's no E, there's no economics. And so there are complaints about capitalism and all that. But one of the striking things about contemporary theory across all the disciplines is the way in which economics has got away with murder. There is no critique of it. People read Hayek as long as they're neoliberals. We don't actually subject Hayek and his successors to any sustained critique. This puzzles me, because it seems to me there's a long tradition that one could get into which would get at the principles, would get at the way in which those principles intersect with other principles. And so in some respects, and this is one instance in which I think theorists are culpable of their own demise. They're actually more interested in things which are nice and interesting and sexy. They don't actually deal with power. They don't deal with authority. And I think this is something that can be said against theorists of all kinds.
I took I actually took a lot of economics classes in my undergraduate degree. I sort of held my nose while I was doing it, and it was precisely because we didn't talk about any of those principles, or we did talk about those principles, but only in order to write them off. So at the beginning of a class that I took on political ecology and the environment, no, I'm giving it too much credit, it was just the economics of the environment. The professor began by saying, I'm going to say something slightly problematic, but it's going to be the foundation for the course. We don't care about anything that doesn't have value to human beings. This is a strictly anthropocentric worldview. If it doesn't have some utility, then we don't care about it. So, here's 8 months of education. And then it proceeded, and everyone kind of just went along with it, and I was horrified, and I went along too, and took it in and tried to understand how the logics of the whole thing worked. But I was conscious the entire time that this is a perverse set of assumptions. And it seems to me that in economics, that's what it begins with. It begins with, here are a problematic set of assumptions, here are some people who thought differently, yeah, there was Marx, yeah, there was Malthus, yeah, there was Ricardo, and so on. We don't talk about them anymore. In the same way that psychology doesn't talk about Freud. They mention him and then just kind of move on. And then you have this relegation of those more marginal figures to other critical areas, right? And then you don't have this precise interdisciplinary kind of conversation that we're talking about. So another one of the problems, it seems to me, to reckon with is how to incorporate those kinds of things in political science, which is more explicitly concerned with politics, but then in economics. And what do you do about that? Or what do you do about the sort of psychology that just has nothing to say about the unconscious and is only interested in laboratory testing? I don't know if that's a question.
Well, it will be interesting to see what follows from the seemingly epochal capital in the 21st century by Piketty, which I'm not sure many have, I know I haven't read, I've been talking about it a lot. But I think I'm with many in that regard. It's a 700-page tome. Wonderful review by Doug Henwood on Book Forum if you're wanting to get a one-page breakdown. But it'll be interesting to see what unfolds from this significant intervention that's been receiving all kinds of press. Again, it is a top seller on Amazon. Piketty himself seems to subscribe to a theory of change that if we get the ideas right, that we can get the right policies. And there isn't really a power analysis in Piketty's work himself. And then others that are getting excited about his work, like Krugman and Stiglitz and all the sort of liberal economists, they too are hoping that this disciplinary change, given the significant power that economics has over public policy, may result in a challenge to neoliberal orthodoxy. It was actually Paul Krugman himself who made the important observation that there was this expectation post-2008 that neoliberalism had been proven wrong by history, and that there was a significant room opened up for sort of social democratic or other kinds of alternatives. But of course that didn't unfold. Instead, a kind of zombie neoliberalism has intensified, and Krugman rightly observed that this is what happens when bad ideas backed by huge amounts of wealth run up against reality, and that's that reality loses, and that power wins. And so whether Piketty's intervention and the ideas therein are going to be able to unsettle power relations will be interesting to watch, but it's unclear. And mostly it seems as if Piketty's work will be a useful resource for activists who seek to challenge concentrated wealth using these well put together ideas as a cornerstone.
Sure, Rick.
So we often talk about critical thinking, and it's important, I think, to realize that it means different things for different people. And there was a professor here a few years ago who told his classes that critical thinking was key to their education, and he then set about telling them what critical thinking was, and critical thinking was essentially rejecting everything that was social democratic in the Canadian state and in the states more broadly. So one has to be careful about what is taken to be critique by different parties. But there are people that have been criticizing economic theory in important ways. James already mentioned David Harvey. What will happen with Piketty's work? It's being widely reviewed. It's a social democratic retake on basic political theory, moving away from, I think, neoliberalism, but taking up a marginalist point of view. So we'll have to see. But it's possibly a work, and there are other works too. Vivek Chinai's work, Spectres of Capital, recently released by Verso, is a very powerful critique that looks at the subaltern school of Indian historiography and criticizes that from a economic point of view as well, from a materialist point of view. So I think my experience is that students tend to shy away from economic theory if it's too abstract and mathematical. But if it can be brought down to real life issues, then they engage with it, and they engage with it enthusiastically. So that's part of the challenge, is to show how theory works in applied situations, and how the applied situations tie back in with theoretical products.
I'm not sure. I mean, thinking historically, that is to say, within the last 25 years. At the moment of founding, I don't think defeat as such was a generalized sentiment. On the contrary, I think if there was a shared sense of an interesting topic, it would have come under the heading of the new social movements, or the critical social movements, or global social movements, or something. Some sense that there was a new left. That is to say, not the old New Left, but the New Left that's focused not on taking the state, but on establishing connections between a whole variety of social movements in different settings. So I actually would characterize the general sentiment as one of a kind of optimism. Indeed, many of us were criticized for being far too optimistic. I think the more negative tone is from a much more recent date. It's this century, actually. When it's clear that all the hopes for some kind of new solidarity fractures in various ways. But I think the question remains an open. What is the replacement for the subject of history? If it's not taking the state, taking the party, it's social democracy and all that. If it's not the collapse of some new global civil society or something, what is the notion of solidarity we're talking about? And I think that's still one of the underlying thematics of much literature, even though since 2000 and whatever, there has been a more negative tone and a sort of defeatist attitude. But I think that's fairly recent. And worrying. Deeply disturbing.
Anyone else in defeat? Sure.
I think it's a really good question. And it's interesting, actually, you pose it. I grew up in Edmonton, and in many ways, my experience with the Edmonton Oilers in those young days has colored my life world, and I find sport metaphors often finding their way into my analysis of politics. But in sports, I hate losing. And as a leftist, I'm fucking losing all the time. And it drives me insane. And so, I don't have a well-defined answer, but I think it's a well-placed question that losing is a reality these days when you're on the left. That said, that this might be naivete, I don't know, but I do feel a kind of optimism. I haven't read the book, but I love the title of Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism. It's a cruel optimism that I feel at the current moment, but there does seem to be heightened space for kind of revolutionary critique and revolutionary possibility. There's a sort of energy around the sort of affect and sensibility of fanaticism in contemporary political theory. So people following up on the work of Joel Olson, who unfortunately passed away at a young age, but thinkers like George Lamar, Glenn Coulthard, a number of others who have come together to form this new journal, Abolitions, Journal of Insurgent Politics. There's a lot of energy around sort of fanaticism. I think Jody Dean in The Communist Hypothesis is kind of engaging with that sensibility and affect of fanaticism in that book quite productively in many ways, although there's limits to it as well. And there's, possible that you can read this movement towards fanaticism as symptomatic of defeat in many respects, and having maybe not thought through in a really careful way the systematic clobbering of the left over the past 30 to 40 years. So that's a possible reading, but I personally feel quite energized by this movement towards fanaticism, and not only the sort of principles behind it around asking for revolutionary transformation, but then also recognizing increasingly the strategic value of fanaticism. So it's not just a principled argument that this is where we stand and there'll be no budging whatsoever, but recognizing the incredible strategic value of radicalism. This is something to learn from the right, I think. And so, I feel emboldened around the both principled and pragmatic value of fanatical radicalism in the current moment. And that feels exciting. But
That also sounds very unthoughtful. Interestingly, like fanatical radicalism, right? Is it necessarily thoughtless to be a far right or a far left radical, to be advocating for a communist rising? I saw Jodie Dean give a talk in which she suggested that we simply need to reprogram people. She used that word unironically.
Yeah, well, I think one of the profound limits of that book is the very cavalier dismissal of the small d or small a, small d Democrat or small a anarchist or big A anarchist critiques of Soviet communism. It's just sort of let's do the party again. That said, I do think that thinking about the party as a political form is not a bad, not a bad move, not a bad idea. But no, I don't think it's necessary to. I think it's possible to have a sort of fanatical and radical sensibility and still be very thoughtful.
My version of it is very similar. This comes out of Mark Wilson rather than Wiseman, who said that there's no more effective way of robbing a generation of political activists than wrapping them up doing theory. When we were initially talking about sort of restarting the CSPT conference series several years ago, someone proposed, why don't we have a conference on the theme of thought, generally speaking, around the education, on education and such. And I remember someone saying, it's a bunch of navel-gazing BS, no one's going to want to do that. So, I mean, aren't we just doing navel-gazing here to re-articulate Tim's question? What's the utility of any of this? Raise one of the points that Jeanette made.
I think this goes to a very profound question. It's a question that you can see emerging in all kinds of different literatures, but it's really an empirical problem. And that goes to whether it's indeed possible now to speak of critique, whether the conditions for critique are now historically past. If you remember Kant's particular version of this, it depends upon an opposition between critique and dogma. And I would say technically Kant's own version of that works within an understanding of humanity as such, within an international system, if you like, such that as long as you assume the distinction between an international and the world beyond, you can have critique. But if that is not in place, if you don't have a particular conception of humanity, call it modernity if you want, then the whole thing doesn't make any sense. And there are all kinds of ways of thinking about the degree to which those historical conditions are past. And I think in many ways programs like this are feeling the reverberations of the historical obsolescence of critique. And they go to these questions we're raising about what are the conditions of effective practice, what now counts as effective practice. And I think it's striking for myself that precisely at the point at which it's become so easy for theory to be co-opted in one way or another, to be treated as a commodity, as simply a trendy thing to do, there's been a decreasing interest in what it means to have the co-optation of dissent. We no longer think about it, for reasons which one could explain. I think it's quite disturbing, actually, the degree to which critical theory has become so uncritical on many, many dimensions. And, intellectually, I think this is scandalous. Historically, I think it's a disaster. And I think, therefore, we have a challenge in programs like this to actually stop resting upon the accepted ways of thinking about the relationship between critique and practice. It's not enough to think that one is radical. It's not enough to think that one is progressive, because probably you have unintended consequences, and this has been well known for a long time. It's quite arguably that the nice people do more damage than the right nasty guys, actually. This is not historically unknown, and people who think of themselves as critical are quite possibly caught up in the things that they are criticizing in an unknown way. So, all this is to be saying, okay, we are in fact in a condition of crisis. We can't name what the crisis is. We give it all kinds of labels, but precisely because we don't know what the problem is, we don't know what to do. Well, surely what we need to do is define what the problem is and actually get your head around the way in which that crisis, although it's sort of invisible and untouchable, is quite profound.
I guess for me, in the current moment, it seems as if a key problem, and it's not the only problem, but a key problem is heightened concentrations of wealth. You look at any of our significant political logjams, be it climate change to healthcare reform in the US or inequality globally, concentrated economic power being wielded to win political outcomes that benefit those with said concentrated wealth and set up institutional arrangements such that they can concentrate wealth even further. This is a very powerful dynamic in the political terrain. And expropriation is a solution. It's an answer. It is a genuine threat to those with this concentrated wealth. And so, personally, I think it's a political priority. I don't think we need to afford ownership over key productive assets, sort of ontological priority or deterministic priority in structuring the social domain. I think we can just see that politically in the current moment, it has incredible structuring power, and it needs to be intervened on, and building up collective power such that that intervention can actually happen viably and doesn't have to sound insane. I think that's an important project.
Anyone else like to address Tim's question?
I don't have a whole lot to add, but I would just quickly say that I think that question is tied to the first question that Liam asked about jobs, because as problematic as institutionalization can be, and as effectively as that could sort of co-opt these things, there are the sort of economic necessities. You have to eat. And the university is, as far as I can tell, the only place that provide those for people who want to do the things that we are doing. So it's a problem, but I just wanted to mention that. I think those two questions are.
Well, I think it's worth keeping in mind that the university has never been a totally emancipatory institution.
What?
It's never been dominated by voices of dissent. The institution has major reproduction functions for the hegemonic order, right? So if we find that in the university, this is not a surprising, this should not be a surprise for anybody, certainly if we look at the historical perspective. But the university can open up certain spaces for dissent if we make it do so. And it's important to have agency in that particular function. And going back to the question about defeat, one way to look at it is that there's more defeats coming if we don't do something about it. And James's point about the concentrations of wealth shaping the possibilities for wealth to accumulate still more. We see this in the US, in the Supreme Court decisions recently about corporations being persons and therefore being able to donate to campaigns. And 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court decision that corporations can donate as much as they want as persons under the guise of free speech to as many campaigns as they want. This is putting huge limits on democracy and democratic decision-making. So there's more defeats looming if we don't do something. In Canada, the Fair Elections Act is, I think, very similar to what Republican governors have been trying to do in the States for the last 15 years at least, limit the vote. And it's important to be mobilized and to be aware of what's going on in different political places, in different institutional locales, and to bring that into the discussions of theory.
Academics don't take themselves seriously as political agents. That is to say, we have learned, or many of us have learned, that we are merely academics, merely in the ivory tower, merely theorists, and have bought into all the negative connotations of all those terms, and therefore see ourselves as caught in a system of mere academics, real world. And this leads to an underestimation of what actually academics do, partly because they think in terms of power, to change this concept. I don't think academics are in the business of power, they're in the business of authority. They are the guys in the world, the people in the world rather, who specialize in the claim to authority. And if you don't have authority, you don't have power. And so the first thing that academics have got to understand is that the fact that they claim authority is an enormous contribution to the politics, their political place in the world. And if they don't take that seriously, nothing's going to happen. So that's the first move. And to have authority now is not the old kind of authority, it's not the standard scholar. Surely authority is going to be collective in some way, which requires all kinds of creativity, the ability to be creative as an authority. And that's going to mean playing an interesting institutional game, probably interdisciplinary, probably inter-institution, probably international, probably intercultural. There is a thing that practice that academics and intellectuals can do, but they constantly undermine themselves. We're theorists. We don't have any effect. Real politics lies elsewhere. I'm sorry to disagree with this, because actually real politics occurs here. It occurs precisely in institutions like this, where real authority is constantly re-legitimized and re-legitimized or not. So I would start there, actually, and insist that if you're going to do theory seriously politically, you take yourself seriously first.
Well, people are looking at me. About interdisciplinarity, generally I would see it as an ongoing project, and I think that there's tools that the different disciplines instill in students and in their practitioners that can be useful to have as skill sets. And so I hesitate to say there won't be any disciplines, but any particular interdisciplinary nexus, I would think, would constantly be open to change. If we're talking about this institution, then if we're talking about this particular program, then having more historical theory in course would probably be a good step forward in a very practical sense. But I'm a little bit surprised about your anecdote about Wallerstein, because he did write at several points very eloquently about being opposed to interdisciplinarity because he saw everything as one large discipline, and argued for unidisciplinarity rather than multi or interdisciplinarity. So that dialogue constantly going on is an important point.
Good. As you know, interdisciplinarity, it depends. Clearly for some things, very important. For others, you get a lot of wishy-washy stuff. Moreover, universities like interdisciplinary programs because they can use them as flagships, like CSPT. We're an interdisciplinary university. Like hell you are. But we have a few programs, and they're cheap, and so it's good PR.
Very cheap.
Very cheap. But it's important to understand where the disciplines come from. It's it's important to understand that they're organized around the state, for the most part, and perhaps moving in conformity to capital, if one thinks about certain movements around this and many other universities. So the political economy of disciplines is very interesting and absolutely crucial for thinking about theory. I would say the issue is not interdisciplinary as such. It's not an interesting question, actually. What is interesting is what kinds of questions you're going to ask. What are the questions of the day? And in the end, CSPT and such things stand or fall simply on whether they have the chutzpah, the virtu, the skill to identify the questions of the day. When you've got the questions, you then might raise questions about, well, who might respond to those questions in an interesting way. But if you dissociate disciplines from the problem, the question, I think you go nowhere. So I would put my money on the question. What questions are now driving us? So we've had stories that involve capital, corporations, environment, da-da-da-da. There are any numbers of them. I would actually say the way in which we are dividing between the ethically human and the inhuman. I would say the distinction between all kinds of humans and non-humans. There's all kinds of stuff, really dangerous, nasty stuff out there. And they pose questions, and they are big questions, and they need to be made precisely, and they need to be framed in a way that one can engage with. So the challenge of our time, I think, is to resist the easy answers and to think through the questions to which we need to have better answers at this particular point, and then link it to questions about what is to be done. Because my own view, actually, is it's all too easy to say, A, what is the problem, and B, what ought to be done about it. As Machiavelli would say, and of course he's my hero in this respect, things change. And if you expected things to be the same tomorrow as they were yesterday, you're finished. And so these kinds of programs really thrive or not on a capacity to identify what's important or not. And yes, we need interdisciplinarity, or maybe we don't. It depends.
We're at 7:30. Last comment?
It doesn't have to be the last comment, but in response to that, I will say, though, that I think answers matter. Questions.
I didn't say they didn't. No, ask a silly question, get a silly answer. Okay?
Sure. But I think that answers do matter, and I think that answers can be forwarded with an appreciation for contingency and change and strategic sensibility in addressing whatever that answer sort of reveals. And so for me, I guess coming out of an interdisciplinary background, I feel very fortunate to be able to draw from a whole number of different archives in sort of identifying sort of macro political problematics that relate to fundamental existential problematics, which result in the need for sort of very multiplous sort of approaches to change that speak to the affective and existential domain, but then also speak to the structural and macro domain. And so I think it is possible to sort of swim in the waters of answers while being attentive to contingency and complexity. And I think that interdisciplinarity for me has been a crucial resource in being able to do so.
This is a weekend of interdisciplinarity. We'll have lots of time to talk more about this in this room. What time do we start tomorrow? Do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, I have a